My job has a formal title, Property Preservation Specialist. It sounds important, clinical even, but in truth, I am a cleaner of abandoned spaces. I step into the lives people have left behind, usually not by choice. These are foreclosed homes, places where families once gathered for holidays and children grew taller against door frames. My work is to clear out the remnants, to make the house an empty shell once more, ready for the market. I document everything, from furniture to forgotten photographs, boxing up personal effects and disposing of what is deemed trash. It is a lonely job, filled with silence and the quiet hum of my own thoughts as I move through rooms that echo with memories that are not mine. It sounds sad, and sometimes it is, but mostly it is just a job, a routine. Usually the work is boring. It is predictable. I arrive at a property, key in hand, and walk through the silent rooms. I make my lists and take my photos. The houses are often messy, sometimes dirty, but they are just buildings. Wood and plaster and glass. They hold no more mystery than the empty boxes I fill. I have seen countless homes in every state of disrepair. Some are left in a hurry, with food still on the table. Others are picked clean, with only dust and shadows remaining. I have grown accustomed to the quiet. I have learned to find a strange sort of peace in the solitude. The world outside fades away, and it is just me in the house, engaged in a silent final conversation before its next life begins. Each house has its own personality, of course. Some feel welcoming, even in their emptiness. They feel like they are waiting patiently for new life to fill their halls. I can almost imagine the laughter that once echoed there. Other houses, however, are different. They feel sullen and unwelcoming. The air inside is heavy, and the silence is not peaceful but watchful. It is a feeling I have learned to recognize, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that makes the hairs on my arms stand up. It is not something you can put in a report. It is just a sense, a feeling that you have trespassed, that you are not wanted there. These are the houses that stay with me, long after I have locked the door for the last time. This job requires a certain detachment. You cannot afford to get lost in the stories left behind. You cannot dwell on the faded family portraits or the children's drawings taped to a refrigerator. If you do, the sadness of it all will swallow you whole. So, you learn to see the objects not as personal treasures, but as inventory. A box of letters becomes personal papers. A child's worn teddy bear becomes miscellaneous toy. You build a wall around your heart. You focus on the task at hand. Check the pipes, secure the windows, change the locks. It is a simple checklist, a way to keep the ghosts of other people's lives at bay. Most of the time, this method works perfectly, but the house in Havenwood was different. It did not want to be ignored. The work order was for a small house in a town called Havenwood, deep in rural upstate New York. The town itself felt like a forgotten postcard. The main street had more boarded-up shops than open ones. It was the kind of place that was slowly fading, shrinking back into the woods that surrounded it on all sides. The instructions were simple. The owner, an elderly woman, had passed away. The house had been empty for over a year. My job was to perform a full clean-out. I drove down winding country roads, the trees forming a dense canopy overhead that blocked out the sun. The silence here was different from the silence of the city. It was deeper, older. It felt like the land was holding its breath, waiting. I found the house at the end of Hemlock Lane, a dead-end street with only two other houses, both of which looked just as neglected. The property was almost consumed by nature. Wild vines climbed the siding like greedy green fingers, and the lawn was a tangled mess of weeds and overgrown grass. The paint was peeling, and a shutter hung crookedly from an upstairs window like a broken wing. It looked lonely, not just empty, but deeply, profoundly lonely. It was a house that had been left to fend for itself against the slow, steady march of time and nature. It seemed to sigh under the weight of its own decay, a sad, tired old place at the end of a forgotten road. As I walked up the cracked concrete path, I felt a familiar unease settle in my stomach. This was one of those houses. The air was still and heavy, and the silence was absolute. There were no birds singing, no distant hum of traffic, just the whisper of the wind through the tall pines that crowded the property line, standing like silent sentinels. The house watched me approach. I know that sounds strange. A house cannot watch. And yet I felt its gaze on me from the dark, vacant windows. It was a feeling of being scrutinized, of being judged. I paused on the porch, my hand hovering over the key, a sudden reluctance to cross the threshold holding me back. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the feeling aside. It was just a house, an old neglected house. My job was to go inside. I turned the key in the lock, and the mechanism groaned in protest. The door swung open with a low, mournful creak, revealing a dark hallway that smelled of dust, mothballs, and something else. Something faint and vaguely sweet, like old perfume or dried flowers. It was the smell of a life that had ended, a scent trapped in time. I stepped inside, my boots echoing on the wooden floorboards. The door swung shut behind me with a soft click, plunging me into the dim, quiet interior. The silence inside was even more profound than it had been outside. It was a weighted, listening silence. My first task was the initial walkthrough. I moved from room to room, my phone in hand, taking pictures to document the condition of the property. The house was cluttered but orderly, as if the owner had just stepped out for a moment. Furniture was draped in white sheets like pale ghosts in the dim light. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sun that pierced through the grimy windows. Everything was coated in a fine layer of gray dust, a blanket of time covering every surface. The house was quiet, so quiet that I could hear the soft thud of my own heartbeat in my ears. It was a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I was in the living room photographing a grand but faded armchair when my phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The sudden noise was a violent intrusion into the deep silence of the house. I fumbled for my phone, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see my boss's name, but the screen was blank. It just said, "Unknown caller." That was strange enough, but what made it truly impossible was the top corner of the screen. There were no bars, no signal. I was deep in the countryside, miles from the nearest cell tower. I hadn't had a single bar of service since I had left the main highway miles back. Hesitantly, I answered the call. I brought the phone to my ear and said, "Hello?" There was no voice on the other end, just static. A harsh, crackling sound, like a radio tuned between stations. It was a dead, empty noise, but it felt strangely active, as if something was struggling to break through the wall of sound. I said hello, again, my voice sounding small and thin in the cavernous silence of the room. The static hissed and popped in my ear, a meaningless and yet unsettling sound. It felt like an ancient electronic whisper from a place far away, a place where normal rules of communication did not apply. After a few seconds of listening to the empty noise, I hung up. I stood there for a moment, my hand trembling slightly. I tried to rationalize it. A glitch, a crossed wire somewhere, a freak signal bounce. There had to be a logical explanation. But the feeling of unease that had been simmering just below the surface now began to boil. The house felt different now. The silence was no longer empty, it was charged, expectant. I looked around the dusty room at the sheet-covered furniture and the dark corners. The feeling of being watched intensified. It felt as if my intrusion had been noted, my presence acknowledged by whatever unseen force resided within these walls. Trying to shake off the strange phone call, I continued my work. I moved into what must have been a small den or office. This room was different. It felt more personal, more lived in than the others. On one wall, there was a large corkboard. It was covered in newspaper clippings. As I stepped closer, I saw that they were all obituaries. Dozens of them, yellowed and brittle with age, each one pinned neatly to the board. They spanned decades. Some were old, the paper faded to a pale cream color. Others were more recent. Each clipping had a name, a date, and a story of a life that had ended. It was a morbid collection, a wall papered with death. Why would someone keep this? Why display it so prominently? In the corner of the room, on a small dusty end table, sat an old rotary phone. It was a heavy black thing, a relic from another era. Its cord was not plugged into a jack on the wall. Instead, the thick black wire was coiled neatly beside it, the metal prongs resting on the wood of the table. The phone was completely disconnected. It was just an object, a piece of decoration. Yet there was something about it that drew my attention. It looked so solid, so permanent, sitting there in the dim light. I reached out and touched its cool plastic surface. It was a strange contrast to the modern, sleek smartphone in my pocket that had just rung without a signal. As I moved through the house, I found other strange and intimate details. In the kitchen, a set of coffee mugs hung on a rack, each with a different name painted on it: Arthur, Helen, Sarah, Michael. They reminded me of my own grandmother's house, of the familiar comforts of family. In a bedroom upstairs, a music box sat open on a dresser, a tiny ballerina frozen mid-twirl. These small, personal touches made the house feel less like a job site and more like a home. But it was a home steeped in a quiet, unsettling sadness. These objects were not just things, they were the last whispers of a life, and they seemed to hold on to the memory of the person who had loved them. The house was a puzzle of contradictions. It was a place of death, with its wall of obituaries. But it was also a place of life, filled with the mundane objects of daily existence. It felt both familiar and deeply alien. The more time I spent inside, the more the house seemed to seep into me. The initial feeling of being an intruder was fading, replaced by a strange sense of connection, as if the house was slowly sharing its secrets with me. But these were not comforting secrets. They were heavy and dark, and they clung to the air like the scent of old, dried flowers. I felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was on the verge of discovering something that I did not want to know. I was upstairs in the main bedroom when my phone rang again. My blood ran cold. The sudden sound was even more jarring this time. I pulled the phone from my pocket with a shaking hand. Again, the screen was blank. Unknown caller. And again, no service displayed in the corner. My logical mind was screaming that this was impossible, that it couldn't be happening. But it was. The phone was ringing in my hand, a shrill, insistent demand in the suffocating silence of the bedroom. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the green answer button. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to throw the phone against the wall and run, but another part, a morbid curiosity, needed to know. I answered the call. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice trembling. For a moment there was only the same crackling static as before. It hissed and popped, a dead-end sound. I was about to hang up, convinced it was just another glitch, when I heard it. Through the static, faint and thin, a voice emerged. It was barely a whisper, old and raspy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was impossible to tell if it was a man or a woman. The voice spoke only 5 words, stretched out slowly, each syllable drawn out in a low, urgent breath. "Don't answer the bedroom phone." The whisper was frail, but it carried an undeniable weight of warning. The line went dead, the static vanished, and my phone returned to its normal, silent state. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, the phone still pressed to my ear. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. "Don't answer the bedroom phone." The words echoed in my mind over and over. I slowly lowered my hand and looked around the room. My eyes landed on it immediately. There, on the bedside table, next to a dusty lamp and a stack of old books, was another phone. It was an identical twin to the one downstairs. A heavy black rotary phone, its cord also disconnected, coiled neatly beside its base. It was just an object, a piece of plastic and wire. But the whispered warning had transformed it into something monstrous. A wave of pure paranoia washed over me. I was no longer just an observer in this house, I was a participant in its strange, silent drama. The feeling of being watched was now overwhelming. A suffocating certainty that I was not alone. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of the wind outside the window sounded like a footstep, a breath. I backed away from the bedside table, my eyes fixed on the black rotary phone. It sat there, inert and silent. Yet it seemed to radiate a palpable sense of menace. The warning had been so specific. Not just "don't answer the phone," but "don't answer the bedroom phone." It was waiting for me, and I had been warned not to answer. I tried to regain my composure. I told myself it was a prank. It had to be. Maybe one of the neighbors was a tech genius with a twisted sense of humor. Maybe a coworker was playing a cruel joke on me. I clung to these rational explanations like a life raft in a storm of fear. But honestly, they felt thin and flimsy. How could anyone know my cell number? How could they call me without a signal? And how could they know about the 2 disconnected rotary phones in this specific house? The logic just crumbled under the weight of the impossible. I decided, to ignore it. I would finish my work, get out of the house, and never think about it again. I would focus on the job. I forced myself to continue my documentation, moving through the upstairs rooms with a sort of forced mechanical calm. But my mind was not on my work. Every few seconds, my eyes would dart back towards the master bedroom, towards the silent black phone on the bedside table. It was a magnet for my fear. The whispered warning had planted a seed of terror in my mind, and it was growing with every passing minute. The silence of the house was no longer just quiet. It was a tense, waiting silence. It felt like the moment before a lightning strike, the air thick with unspoken energy. I could feel the house holding its breath, and I was holding mine right along with it. I was in the small bathroom across the hall, taking a picture of a rust-stained sink, when I heard it. A sound that should not have been possible, a sound that shattered the silence and my sanity along with it. A loud, shrill, metallic ring. It was not my cell phone. It was an old-fashioned ring, the kind that drilled into your ears. It was coming from the bedroom. My blood turned to ice. I stood frozen, my phone slipping from my numb fingers and clattering into the sink. Ring, ring, ring. The sound was insistent, demanding. It was the black rotary phone, the disconnected phone. It was ringing. Fear, cold and absolute, seized me. Every rational thought evaporated, leaving only a primal instinct to flee. But I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I could only stand there in the dim hallway, listening to the impossible sound. Ring, ring, ring. It echoed through the silent house, a sound from a nightmare. It was a direct violation of the laws of physics, a message from a place beyond reason. The whispered warning came back to me, don't answer the bedroom phone. The ringing was a summons, an invitation to something terrible. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that if I were to walk into that room and pick up that receiver, I would hear something that I was never meant to hear. The ringing finally stopped. It was as if a switch had been flipped, plunging the house back into a silence that was now 1,000 times more terrifying than the noise had been. The absence of the ringing was a presence in itself, a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body trembling uncontrollably. I knew I had to leave. I had to get out of that house immediately. My job, my report, none of it mattered anymore. My only thought was escape. I turned to run, to flee out the front door and never look back. But as I stumbled towards the stairs, something made me stop. A thought. A memory from the work order. Check basement for water damage. It was a stupid, irrational impulse. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But the professional in me, the part that had been trained to follow a checklist, made one last foolish stand. I had to go to the basement. It felt like a compulsion, as if the house itself was guiding my steps, unwilling to let me go until I had seen its final secret. I found the basement door in the kitchen, a plain wooden door with a simple hook latch. My hand shook as I lifted the hook. The door swung inward, revealing a set of steep, rickety wooden stairs leading down into a vast, inky blackness. A damp, earthy smell, like a freshly dug grave, wafted up to meet me. I used the flashlight on my phone to pierce the darkness. The beam cut a weak path down the stairs. I descended slowly, each creaking step echoing in the cold, damp air. The basement was huge, with stone walls and a low ceiling crisscrossed with pipes. The air was frigid, a stark contrast to the stuffy warmth of the house above. My flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing piles of old furniture, stacks of newspapers, and cobwebs thick as cotton candy. In the center of the room, sitting alone as if placed there for a viewing, was a small, simple wooden table. On the table was a single object, a spiral-bound notebook. I approached the table, my flashlight beam trembling. The notebook was old, its cover faded and worn. I reached out and opened it. The pages were filled with neat, spidery handwriting. It was a logbook, a record. Each entry began with a name, then a date, and next to each date, a short, cryptic message. Arthur, June 10th, 1988. He answered the call. Helen, May 3rd, 1995. She answered the call. Sarah, December 21st, 2004. She answered the call. The names from the coffee mugs. I flipped through the pages. There were dozens of names. Many of them matched the names on the obituaries I had seen on the corkboard upstairs. The final entry on the last written page was different. It just had one word, written in a shaky, frantic script. Me. The single word on that last page hit me like a physical blow. Me, the owner of the house, the woman who had collected the obituaries. She had received a call, too, and she had answered it. I slammed the notebook shut, a cloud of dust puffing into the air. That was it. I was done. The last shred of my composure, the last ounce of my professional duty just dissolved into pure, unadulterated terror. The basement suddenly felt like a tomb, and I felt the walls closing in on me. The cold, damp air was no longer just chilly. It was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I had to get out. I had to get back into the sunlight. I didn't walk up the stairs. I scrambled. I clawed my way up the rickety wooden steps, my breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. I burst through the basement door and didn't stop running. I flew through the kitchen, my boots slipping on the linoleum floor. I ran down the dark hallway, past the living room with its ghostly sheet-covered furniture. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to. I could feel the house watching me go, a malevolent intelligence in the very walls, disappointed that I had not answered its call. I fumbled with the lock on the front door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the knob. The door finally swung open and I stumbled out onto the porch, into the bright, blessed daylight. I didn't just walk to my truck, I ran. I sprinted across the overgrown lawn, the tall weeds whipping at my legs. I didn't look back at the house. I couldn't. I was afraid of what I might see looking back at me from one of those dark, empty windows. I jumped into my truck, jammed the key into the ignition, and slammed the doors shut, locking them. The engine roared to life, a beautiful modern sound that cut through the ancient, oppressive silence of Hemlock Lane. I threw the truck into reverse and sped out of the driveway, gravel spitting from beneath my tires. I didn't slow down until the house was no longer visible in my rearview mirror, until the town of Havenwood was miles behind me. When I finally felt safe enough to pull over, my heart was still hammering against my ribs. I sat in my truck on the side of the highway, the sun warm on my face, and tried to breathe. I had to file a report. I took out my phone and typed. I mentioned the overgrown yard, the clutter, the general state of disrepair. I wrote that the property was unsafe due to potential structural issues and recommended that a full team be sent in. I omitted everything else. The phone calls without a signal, the whispered warning, the disconnected phone that rang, the notebook in the basement. How could I explain any of that? They would think I was crazy. They would have me fired. I filed the incomplete report and drove away, leaving the secrets of the house on Hemlock Lane behind me. I quit my job a week later. I couldn't do it anymore. Every time I was assigned a new house, a wave of anxiety would wash over me. Every quiet, empty room reminded me of that house in Havenwood. Every shadow seemed to hold a watchful presence. The peace I once found in the solitude of my work was gone, replaced by a constant gnawing fear. The job was ruined for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something that was not meant for the living, a dark little corner of the world where the rules of reality were thin and easily broken. I found a new job, one in a noisy office building surrounded by people. I welcomed the noise. I never wanted to be alone in a quiet house again. A few months passed. I was trying to put the experience behind me, to convince myself that it was all just a product of an overactive imagination, a stressful day in a creepy old house. I had almost succeeded when I got a call from an old coworker, a man named Dave. We had worked together on a few jobs and we had always gotten along. He told me he had just quit. I asked him why. He hesitated for a moment, and then he told me. He had been assigned a follow-up visit to a property in a small town called Havenwood, a house on Hemlock Lane, a house I had flagged as unsafe. Dave's voice was low and shaky over the phone. He said he had gone to the house to assess what needed to be done. He told me about the strange feeling of being watched. He told me about getting a phone call from an unknown number, even though he had no cell service. He told me he heard only static. My blood ran cold as I listened. He was describing my own experience, step by step. Then he told me about the phone call he got upstairs. A faint, raspy whisper that had warned him not to answer the phone in the bedroom. He left immediately, he said. He didn't even go into the basement. He drove straight back to the office, handed in his keys, and resigned on the spot. He asked me if I had experienced anything strange when I was there. I lied. I told him no, that I had only been concerned about the structural integrity of the place. I couldn't bring myself to share the truth, to admit that I had heard the ringing phone and found that horrible notebook. To speak it aloud would make it too real. We ended the call, and I sat there in the bright, sterile light of my new office, trembling. Was it an elaborate, cruel prank passed from one worker to the next? Or was it something else? Something that lived in that house, reaching out through dead wires, collecting names in a dusty old book? I don't have the answer, and I know with absolute certainty that I never want to find it.